25 years, mostly with Unilever, then Diageo, and then T-Mobile. And it was whilst I was at T-Mobile that I became a client of Decode. And Decode was founded by neuroscientists and psychologists. And they honestly taught me more in 1 year about shoppers and customers and consumers' behaviour and decision making than I'd learnt in my entire career, and just completely blew my mind. But it wasn't just academic interest, it wasn't just theory and abstract. It was very practical, and the work we did together led to the relaunch of the T-Mobile brand, notably in the UK with one advert, Liverpool Street Dance, which you can find on YouTube. That one advert drove sales up by 49% and doubled footfall into stores. We actually had store managers ringing the very next day saying, what is going on? We just can't cope, we've got people coming to store. So it was a real moment for me, a revelation that this was terribly exciting and profound and significant for marketing in general. And as a result of that, I actually quit my client-side career to set Decode up in the UK, in the middle of a recession, with no clients. You may think I'm mad, but that, I hope, proves to you my utter conviction for the power of this approach. So what is neuromarketing about? What's it for? Why are we giving up 2 days of our time to come here? What goal do we all share? Well, I think that goal is simple. It's about behaviour change. We're all in the business of behaviour change. And marketing is about influencing behaviour, full stop. We want people to purchase our brands in favour of somebody else. We want people to purchase more on their shopping trip with us. We want them to choose our products instead of a competitor. We want them to buy more items in my store than they buy in any other store. And to do that, we really need to understand why people buy what they buy. Why do they do what they do? And with neuromarketing, there's the promise that we can better understand and predict consumer decision making. Why is that? What is neuromarketing? I mean, one of the first things that surprised me was that a Nobel Prize-winning neuroscientist said that there's been more learned in the last 5 years than in the whole history of mankind about the brain, about how it operates and what it does. And neuroscientists will tell you they're still only scratching the surface of this incredible thing between our ears. Let's just look at the genesis, one of the very first experiments in this area. 2001, a piece of Fmri research combining brain study with Professor Daniel Kahneman, who we've heard briefly about, who's a psychologist, and he did a lot of work on prospect theory, economic decision-making under uncertainty. And what this experiment showed, that if people have a choice of gains and losses, that if, for example, they could win $2.50, the perceived value of that potential gain depends on what else is available. So if we could have won $10, then $2.50 looks disappointing. On the other hand, if the alternative was a zero or a loss, then $2.50 looks like a very good option. Well, you might be sitting there thinking, so what? That's obvious. We all know that. Well, the breakthrough was that Brighton, the scientist, looked at actually what was going on in the brain at these points in time. And he found what are called the neural correlates. It's what correlates in brain activity with the output of this sort of somehow irrational effect. And he found that there was a network of interrelated structures that coordinate the processing of what were called goal-related stimuli. And this was really the beginning. This was the first time that consumer psychology had been merged with hard science. And the Brighton study shows the core of this subject and why we're here for these 2 days. And this is the best definition that I've found for neuromarketing. Why? Because it links the scientific study of the nervous system, which is what neuroscience is all about, with behaviour. Now, Hilke Plasman, who is quoted here, is a neuroscientist who's now a professor at INSEAD and has done some groundbreaking work in this field. It's really about finding what's going on in the brain that predicts, at the moment of decision-making, that we can use to predict decision-making and behaviour. So what does this bring to the table for us? Well, from a business perspective, it's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to use science to better understand what drives and shapes behaviour. And this is actually of profound significance for brands. In this study, people were asked to name their favourite brands in a number of different categories. They were also asked to name other brands which they would consider buying. So their consideration set, if you like, we call it in marketing. And they were shown two images. Could be their favourite brand, could be one of the other brands they consider buying. And the task was simple. Look at an image and choose a brand to buy. Now what you can see here is the Fmri results of the same person faced with those two tasks. And in the image on the right, hardly any brain activity. The image on the left, lots of activity, so-called hotspots, indicative of blood oxidation, which indicates neuronal activity. So, which do you think is the response to the favourite brand? Well, when I first saw this as a marketing director, I said it's obvious. It's the one on the left, because I've spent years building this brand equity, advertising, promoting, etc., etc. Well, the surprising thing is, it's the other way around. Why? Because the brain on the left is thinking. The brain on the right has seen its favourite and decided just like that. So this is absolutely profound for brands, because in some categories it can be that the greatest success you can ever achieve is to be chosen without reflective conscious thought. And some studies in neuroscience prove what we felt for a long time intuitively, and that has value in itself, but at other times they challenge us. They really fundamentally rock the foundations of our paradigms and what we knew. For example, we all use human characteristics when we're talking about brand positioning. Indeed, we call it brand personality. Yet a study by a scientist called Yoon found that the brain areas involved in making judgments about human traits for people do not overlap with the brain areas involved in making judgments about human traits for brands. And these findings challenge the view that we associate brands with personalities and that we're able to form relationships with brands in the same way that we form relationships with people. So it challenges our paradigms. Another interesting topic, what actually drives purchase? Is it liking or is it wanting? Normally, in research, we ask people if they like something. And we assume that there's a causal relationship. But science tells us otherwise. There are studies that show that liking is not wanting. It's been known for a while that wanting and liking are regulated by different neural circuits in the brain. We all experience this in our own lives. It's perfectly possible to like something and you not actually want it or not actually buy it. We love the old bookstore around the corner, but we buy all of our books on Amazon. And in another study, Burns and Moore used brain imaging to measure the response of a group of adolescents who were listening to songs of relatively unknown artists. And after they did the scanning, they asked the respondents to rate their liking of the songs. And the goal of the research was to predict future sales. Could we identify what would predict future sales? So what they did was they actually tracked the sales of those songs for the following 3 years. And then they identified the neural correlates of sales by correlating what happened in the brain system with actual sales. And they found there was a significant correlation between activation in the so-called reward system in the brain and future sales. The songs which elicited a high response in the reward system enjoyed significantly higher sales compared to songs that didn't activate the system. Now the interesting thing is when they looked at the activity in the reward system compared to subjective likability, they found that subjective likability was not predictive of sales. So liking is not necessarily wanting. Another motivation to get beyond what people say and what they do is this. You may know this quotation, famous from David Ogilvy, the founder of the Ogilvy Advertising Agency. He said this decades ago. Consumers don't think how they feel, they don't say what they think, and they don't do what they say. And as Michel said earlier, when we ask consumers, we cannot rely on what they tell us. Another psychology professor who's done a lot of work in this area, Brian Nosek, University of Virginia, had said something which I really like, which is It's easy to believe that there's more going on in people's minds than they say, but it's not easy to believe that there's more going on in my head than I say. And consumers underestimate the influence of subtle or even unconscious aspects. For example, when these packs were tested in focus groups, people preferred the one on the left because they said the cookies looked bigger. However, when they were in a real shopping situation under time pressure and distracted, they chose the one on the right because there are more in the pack. And this is where the other measurements, which we're going to hear a lot more about over the next 2 days, can be very appealing because they observe, they don't ask consumers. We're looking at real behaviour. And that, of course, has been accompanied by a lot of technical progress. All of these methods have got better, faster, cheaper, more portable, easier to use. And you'll hear a lot more about those in the next couple of days. But those techniques do require some know-how. They will have pros and cons. But there's another watch-out, really, which is that we can't just delegate these insights to research. It's too easy to say, oh, this is just a measurement method, and we take care of measurement, so we'll look after it. Or it might even be we compared it with other methods, existing methods, and we found that it confirmed what we already knew, so we'll stick with our existing methods. I would argue that if we simply narrow our definition of neuromarketing to research, we will lose a huge amount of the insights that it offers. But there is a broader perspective on neuromarketing that uses insights from science, from behavioural economics, from psychology, and from neuroscience, neuroeconomics, to better understand this decision-making, and hence empower us to better influence and shape behaviour in our favour. And this perspective, measurement becomes a means to an end. And the end is the important thing, and that is changing behaviour more effectively. And this is exactly what we do as a company. We apply these insights in the area of consultancy, training, and research as well. Now, I'm going to show you more about this broader mental model and the insights and consequences that it offers. Firstly, a groundbreaking study by Brian Knudsen at Stanford found that the brain actually follows a very simple logic when making a purchase decision. In this task, people were shown images of brands with which they were familiar. They were then shown the price of the brand, and then they were asked whether they would buy that brand for that price. And what Stanford and his colleagues did was measure, using Fmri, what happened in the brain at those points in time. Now, some very interesting things happened. When they were shown an image of the brand, the reward centre lit up in the brain. Now, this is significant because this is the same part of the brain that lights up if, for example, a mother sees an image of the children. That's pretty profound, but I'm not suggesting for one moment that a box of Godiva chocolates is a substitute for a child, although some might argue otherwise. But what it does tell us is that the brain hasn't suddenly grown a whole new region to deal with relatively new phenomena such as brands. What it does is it uses things that are already there, structures are already in place. And a brand is rewarding because it's pleasurable. Simple as that. And when they were showing price, something very different happened in the brain. People normally say, well, I guess the reward centre kind of deactivated. But what actually happened was a different part of the brain was activated. The pain centre. This is the same part of the brain that's triggered if you cut yourself or fall over. But again, intuitively this makes sense. Looking at this primitively, the brand is pleasurable and the pain is the opposite of pleasure. I want this, but ouch, it costs me, it pains me, it hurts me to pay for that. Now, the interesting thing was the neuroscientists, based on the level of activation in these two areas, were able to predict whether the person would buy the brand for the price. What it seemed to be is the decision was based on the net value, whether the size of the reward or the value was sufficient to overcome the pain of the price. And if it was, then the decision was to buy. So there's a very simple neurologic of purchase decision. But of course, reward and value are not just explicit, objective things. They are, like the explicit price, but there's an implicit level as well. How is the price perceived? What other behavioural costs are involved in obtaining this good or this service. For example, a Swiss tourist company found out that their business was suffering because potential customers had to go into the shops and ask a salesperson for a brochure. And apparently for Swiss people, this sort of contact is a barrier. So what happened was they simply redesigned their shops so that people could go in and pick up brochures without having to see or be seen by a salesperson. And that reduced the behavioural costs of doing business with that company. And their sales went up by 30%. Let's look at some other examples that show that this value and cost is not simply the old economic theory. In this example, the daily special at a restaurant was shown on a chalkboard. The only difference was the way that price was displayed. So how come the one in the middle, without the euro symbol or the euro word, actually sold more? And how come, with these two discounts, £8 down to £5.99, objectively identical left and right, but subjectively different? One of them drove sales more than the other. I'm not going to give you the answer because this will be part of your gut feel challenge later on, and I'm happy to explain the difference then. How come when Snickers was put on promotion with a message saying buy some for your freezer, the average rate of sale was 1.4 bars, yet when the message was changed to buy 18 for your freezer, sales nearly doubled? How come when these two packs were tested that the pack on the right showed a 20% higher purchase intent than the one on the left? And how come when people participated in a trial with a car wash, which was a loyalty scheme, buy 8 car washes, get one free, and 2 loyalty tickets or passes were produced. Now, objectively, they are identical. You have to buy 8 car washes in order to get the free one, but subjectively you can see they're different. The one on the right has 10 car washes, but the first 2 are pre-stamped. Now, you wouldn't think that would make any difference, right? Because rationally, they're identical. Look at the difference, nearly 80% increase in sales. And this is explained by something called the process endowment effect. The fact is the goal of completion was already triggered. It was already started by having those 2 pre-stamped. And this reduced the perceived behavioural cost of achieving the goal. It's like in a service environment, waiting time is a huge behavioural cost. But if you get people to place their order and then wait, rather than wait and then place their order, you can greatly reduce the perceived waiting time and the perceived behavioural cost if they place their order up front, because the goal is activated. They are on their way. Now, incidentally, with this example, people who participated using the card on the right also rated the car wash more positively and stayed car wash customers for longer. So a conclusion of these examples is to show you that there is something else going on. There's another level of value and cost. And the foundation for it is this. Michelle's already alluded to him, Professor Daniel Kahneman. This is a screenshot from his Nobel Prize winning lecture in 2002. He's a psychology professor. He won the prize for economic sciences, looking at decision making. And since his prize, a lot of neuroscientists have been working with what was a model, but then improving it by mapping brain regions to these 2 systems of Kahneman proposed, System 1, System 2. We use a metaphor of these, one being an autopilot and the other being a pilot, that I think is quite helpful, because the autopilot, System 1, does the majority of the work. It does all the difficult stuff, all the heavy lifting. The pilot is there, of course, to override and intervene where necessary, when new information comes in, or when something unexpected happens, or when something new needs to be learned. But these have very different characteristics as systems. The autopilot is very fast. It works associatively, spontaneously, intuitively, and automatically. So if I said to you, what's 2 times 2? That number just magically appears in your head. But if I said to you what's 17.3 times 28.47, unless you had a very misspent youth, I don't think the answer would appear in your head. Because you have to engage your pilot system, System 2, to work out the answer. So the autopilot is really geared for action, whereas the pilot is geared for when you've learnt to drive. Your first driving lesson was a complete nightmare, wasn't it? I mean, we had the instructor talking to us, we had other cars on the road, there was road signs, there was hand-eye coordination, it's like, oh, what's going on? Nowadays you can drive from your home to your office and you don't even remember the journey or how you got there, because you've learned that. It's become implicit. It's like tying your shoelaces. It's a very complex task if you have to write down what you do, but once you learned it at an early age, it becomes implicit. And these systems are characterized also by their vast differences in processing speed. The autopilot processes data at about 11 million bits per second, whereas the pilot processes data at about 40 bits per second. Now, for those of you who are old enough to remember dial-up internet, 40 bits per second is even slower. And it's not enough to get you out of the house in the morning. It really isn't, which is why so much of what we do is learned and it becomes automatic. And there are 4 conditions that under which the pilot gives up and defaults to the autopilot because it's easier to process. And those conditions are the following. Complexity. When there's just too many variables to process with 40 bits, we resort to autopilot processing. Low involvement or low motivation. There's no high risk to us as an individual or monetary risk, low motivation to get involved in the decision. It's an autopilot process. Overload. When there are just too many tasks stacked on top of each other. It's like when someone enters a room and you're listening to a speaker and suddenly you drop you can't hear what I'm saying because you drop that task to attend to another. And then finally is time pressure. When we just don't have time to process with 40 bits, we resort to autopilot processing. Now remember back to that slide I showed you with the 2 brains. You can see that the brain on the left with all the hotspots was pilot processing. The brain on the right with hardly any activity was autopilot. Now this is quite interesting for marketeers because normally we measure things on recall and we measure attitude change. And the model is, I see an advert, it changes my attitude, the next time I'm in store I recall it and I buy the product. Simple, huh? And yet, Michelle's already told us, the Popeye study shows that somewhere between 65 and 76% of purchases are decided at point of sale. And the simple reason is because the autopilot is stimulus bound. So we really need to understand this decision-making process of customers and align our metrics and align our tools with that. Because otherwise we can find we're measuring stuff that is simply not relevant. Potentially, if we measure differently, what could happen? Well, firstly, we could get the same result, but with a different method, so why not stick to the old method? Or secondly, we get different results, so then which is right and which is wrong? And the answer is, really, it depends. Both systems, the autopilot and the pilot, are in place all the time. So we need to understand the nature of the decision to know which to measure and how to measure it. Now, what's going on in this autopilot? What do we need to consider and how can we actually work with it? This is the framework that we use that helps us to understand really the path of purchase from left to right, from signal to behaviour. There are processes that happen in the brain. Signals on the left-hand side, these are things that we are sending to the customer or the shopper. Above the line, below the line, point of sale, packaging. And finally, on the right-hand side, we have behaviour, the purchase decision. And the steps in between, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on. They are attention and perception, recognition and meaning, and then decision rules and value. And we're going to go through those in a moment. But there are 2 critical things that I want to point out that are ever present, and they're at the top and the bottom. Associative memory. We already heard the autopilot works automatically and associatively. Everything that we've learned from birth onwards is organised in neural networks, what fires together, wires together. If you imagine when we're born, our brains are like fields of white snow, and as we walk across the field, we start to create a path. And if we walk back, that path becomes more defined. And if we use it continuously, it's faster and easier to navigate. And that's like a neural network. We're connecting A with B. And the more often that association is made, the more certain we are, and the stronger and faster the association. And the second is context. I'm going to talk about context a bit later, because all of this is wrapped up in context. Now, within these three blocks, there are something like, we work with something like 120 different principles, and clearly I haven't got time to do them justice in 30 minutes. We run 1 and 2 day shopper marketing workshops to really dive deep and focus on these. But I'm going to introduce you to a few of the concepts. Firstly, attention and perception. This is the gateway into the brain. Without perception first, a key component of the autopilot, nothing else follows. Signals coming in through our 5 senses, 90% of which are visual. And let's see why attention is so important. Michelle talked about fixations. Why is this really important? Well, some studies on attention by a scientist called Koch showed what's called the drift diffusion effect. So when we're faced with choices, in the task that he did, it was between faces, but it also applies to packs as well. And we're trying to decide between the two. In this case, the task was which is the most attractive. What we find is that we look between one and the other repeatedly, and this can be measured by eye tracking. And we look at one longer, and then we flick back to the other, and then back to another one. And we eventually reach a decision threshold where we choose one over the other. And that happens to be the one that we have looked at for longest. Now, this is measured in milliseconds, of course, but that shows that there is a value in attention itself. The fact that we have paid attention, fixated on this one longer than the other, is a value in itself. And why is that significant? Because this drift diffusion explains between 40 and 70% of purchase decisions. Secondly, in terms of perception, we like to think of ourselves as having 20/20 vision, full colour, pin sharp. The reality is very different. The eye is not a camera. In reality, what we see is only a very small part of our vision is pin sharp and in full colour, so-called foveal vision, about 2 degrees of vision. This is where we fixate. The rest, the majority of our vision is peripheral. And as we move to the periphery, our vision becomes increasingly blurred and less saturated in colour. Why is this significant? Well, you imagine walking down an aisle with your trolley, this is what you see. So our packaging and our promotions need to work under conditions of blurring. And that's one of the reasons, and Michelle talked about this orange juice case, that's one reason why that pack failed, because they removed an icon that was visible under blurred conditions, but as soon as they took it away, it started to look just like the distributor or the retailer's own brand. So how can we attract attention? Well, look at this and tell me what jumps out. And if we were to do eye tracking, these are the sort of results you would get. And this is one of the principles of attention. Contrast. It's what is called bottom-up attention. Bottom-up means it's stimulus or signal-based attention. Contrast in colour or shape or size is a very good way of driving attention. And here are a couple of examples from the UK, from Innocent Drinks. They've used some quite clever devices to produce contrast in colour, shape and size. Here a shelf talker that looks like grass, and the message being pick your own. And here a promotion where they've completely changed the shape and colours of the bottles by putting little woolly caps on them, and that's certain to drive attention. But attention can also be driven by top-down processes. And to prove that, I'm showing you an image of a glass jar covered with dolphins, just so you can see the effect of this top-down process. What? What's the problem? You can't see dolphins? Are you mad? No? Okay. Relax. You have just proven that you are adults and beings. There are dolphins on this pack. The dark areas, there's a head and a tail and a head and a tail and a tail and a head. tail and a head, tail and a head. There's about 8 or 9 dolphins on there. Now, if this image is shown, okay, and now even though I've pointed them out, you're still struggling to see them. I know. And that's the power of the autopilot. It has actually shaped your perception as well as driven your attention. When this image is shown to children, they tend to see dolphins. Why? Because dolphins are rewarding to them. But a different image is far more rewarding to you as healthy adult human beings. Now this is really significant because if you're in the business of selling dolphins and this is your pack design or your advert or your shelf talk, then you're in big trouble. But what this shows is that this top-down process of attention is driven by our goals, it's driven by what we find rewarding. We see what we're searching for. And what happened then, as soon as I put that screen up, you saw an image in milliseconds with no conscious control, effortlessly, spontaneously, automatically. That was pure autopilot processing. We see what we're searching for, whether it's categories, brands, discounts, savings, or benefits. So to gain attention, we need to signal to the brain that our products best fit the goals of consumers. And as I said, the vast majority of our vision is peripheral. We saw it's blurred. We can't see details. We cannot read. Yet how come, for example, when we're interested in a certain type of car, we suddenly start to see them everywhere on the road? Well, eye tracking studies show that people, for example, who are hungry look at food-related signs more than those who aren't. But even though they are completely unaware that they're looking at food-related signs. This is the top-down process. It relates to what goals are currently active for us. And this was proved by a psychologist known as Yarbus, who did an eye tracking study and showed that where people looked at on this painting, you can see the eye tracking on the right-hand side, depended entirely on the goal that they'd been given, whether it was to ascertain the ages of the people in the family or the wealth of the family. We look at different things. So now let's look at the middle box, recognition and meaning. These are metaphorical questions that the brain asks. What is it? What does it represent? Now if I put this up, this is a picture you've probably never seen before, yet you will have no doubt in your mind who this is. You know who these people are. Or if I show you this, it's not actually the Coca-Cola logo, but you identify it as such. But how come? Well, the fact is we don't have a picture library in our heads. If we did, we would have to see the exact same thing every time in order to recognise it for what it is. A car would have to be a certain size, shape and colour for us to recognise it as a car. But of course that's not the case. So how can we recognise what it is? Well, the brain says, what is it? What does it represent? We use what are called constitutive signals, and here the red colour or the flowing script. Or in this example, we learn through associative memory that diet or light products are coloured light blue with a lower saturation of colour. Or here, even under conditions of blurring and peripheral vision, we can probably guess what product that is. Now this can really help you answer key questions like, what are my brand's iconic assets? And if I'm going to redesign something, what must I keep and what can I change? Because we need to understand what cuts through under these sorts of conditions. Now finally, let's look at the psychological processes behind decision rules and value. Firstly, the concept of heuristics. These are automated rules of decision making, so-called rules of thumb or shortcuts. They're like habits. They're activated by a signal and then they automatically influence the subjective attractiveness of products and the probability of purchase. And research has revealed a whole series of these heuristics, many of which have been applied in marketing for a long time. For example, scarcity, or authority, or social proof. And this is now being used in public policy, even in the UK. Her Majesty's Revenue, the tax authorities, have estimated that they've increased their tax return by £200 million by asking people, when they send out the tax returns, by telling people how many people in their neighbourhood have already returned their tax, completed their tax form. So social proof, we do what others do. But people differ as to which of those they react to most strongly. Some react more strongly to, for example, the bestseller argument. You know, how many people have bought. You see this often online, on Amazon and hotel and holiday and flight companies. Others might be persuaded by authority, the expert's recommendation. But it's interesting that this particular disposition is stable across product categories. So if we react more strongly to the bestseller argument with books, then we will do the same with other products as well. Here's another example of a heuristic. Campbell's Soup study, price promotion, 12% off. They sold 3.3 cans on average. When that message was changed to a maximum of 4 cans per person, still with the same price reduction, sales went up slightly. But when they changed it to maximum 12 cans per person, rate of sale doubled. Why? Two reasons. One is the anchoring principle. Perception is always relative, so the first piece of information we see is like an anchor against which we judge everything else. And in that case, 12 is the anchor, so then anything less than 12 seems like a reasonable purchase, which is why the sales went up from 3 to 7. And scarcity as well. There seems to be a shortage of Campbell's Soup, believe it or not, and that helps as well. So some very simple principles here that can be applied to great effect. Now I mentioned context. This is hugely important because it affects everything we do. We choose and use different brands depending on the situation we're in or the context. Now this can be an internal context, whether I'm buying things as a mother or as a partner, or it could be an external context, the company I'm in, the temperature, the day. I mean, think about your own behaviour, what drinks you choose when you're with your mates in a bar compared to at home, compared to at a business lunch or whatever. Our choices differ greatly, and this is reflected in the very basic equation from psychology that behaviour is the product of person times situation, and we've normally focused only on the person. We must not ignore situation. And it is really important because we are able to change behaviour without changing minds, by changing the context. This was a lovely experiment by Brian Vansing in the US, who was trying to change students' eating habits. Now they put up lots of posters around campus in this college saying eat more healthily and promotions, etc., and it didn't have any effect whatsoever. So what they did was change the context. They changed the layout of the canteen. And they found, for example, that by putting broccoli at the start of the lunch line, sales went up by 10 to 15%. Putting the salad bar at the checkout, sales of salads tripled. Putting fruit in ceramic bowls rather than stainless steel bowls, doubled sales of fruit. And you can see, like entering stores, studies have shown that people normally tend to go to the right, if you put arrows pointing them to the left, you can change the context and change their behaviour. And this is of critical importance to retailers, because the big question is, why don't people buy everything they need from me? Why am I under fair share in certain categories? I have the same price, the same range, same promotions as my competitors. So how can I at least get fair share? And the answer is because our associative memory is context specific. It's been proven that the context in which we learn things influences how those things are subsequently evoked and remembered. So for example, if we learn something underwater, bizarre though it may sound, we can recall it better when we're underwater. But it's the reason why when people are drunk and they put the drink away, they cannot remember where they hid the drink when they're sober again, but as soon as they become drunk, they know exactly where it is. Because what binds together... that's why. Because what binds together wires together. So we can enter a store and simply just not think of buying a certain category or item there because we haven't got those associations, because the habits have become ingrained. And this is why nudges and context are so critical. For example, bundling items together, so things that people normally buy and things that they don't normally buy, because then the product they don't normally buy becomes salient and it becomes associated with that retailer and it's used. And that can lead to attitude change and hence behavioural change. And then finally I want to talk about goals as a concept as well of motivation. Firstly, which of these two squares is darker? Trick question. They're identical. Darker. They are actually still identical, but you can't help but seeing them as different because what we've done is put a frame around them, and your autopilot drives perception, and it now perceives the one on the right as darker. And the analogy between products and brands is perfect. The central grey square can be identical, virtually identical products, yet when we frame it with a brand, it's perceived as different. And that's the case across all categories. The most famous study here is Coke versus Pepsi. Tasted blind, Pepsi wins. Tasted branded, Coke wins, because the frame changes it. And retail brands are frames. The retailer per se acts as the context in which we're shopping. And many studies show that priming customers with different retailer logos leads them to show different purchase behaviours. And in certain retailers, different goals are activated to others. And this is a bottom-up process. So with Walmart, it's value. With Nordstrom, it's luxury. And if retailers are associated with certain goals, and if they match mine, then I'll shop there and I'll buy those particular categories or those particular products. And as we saw, goals affect the very early part of the process, attention and perception. And so they're very, very important because we can observe behaviour, of course, we can measure behaviour, but that's the output. And we need to complete the picture, we need to understand the why behind the what of behaviour and how to trigger this. And beyond the obvious explicit goals of things like value for money and location, there are implicit goals that help to explain the differentiation between brands. And this is an area we specialise in, I'd be happy to talk about in the break. So it's not surprising to find examples such as this one from Mondelez Craft Foods that shows how the internal context of the shopper is reflected in the goals associated with a shopping trip, and why certain retailers are over or under fair share in particular food categories. So these principles can be really very, very powerful. If we know that a shopper in retailer X may be prone to certain heuristics and or have certain goals, then this can make our activities far more effective and efficient. And if shopping decisions are stimulus-based, then we have a huge potential to change behaviour. Now, I'd just like to conclude now by saying basically this is a paradigm shift in everything we've learned, certainly as I learned as a marketeer. If we keep asking the same questions and applying the same old requirements, we lose the power of these insights. If we narrow it down to just, well, we're measuring things differently, added value will be low. We're all in the business of behaviour change. So I think we need to embrace this paradigm shift and change the way we look at behaviours. For those of you who find this interesting, then I'm allowed, I think, to recommend a certain book on this subject, and you can read more about it, or of course, talk to us about it later. So thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much. Great presentation. Thanks for the practical solutions that you gave us. Are there any questions for Phil?
You showed us one scientific article about one thing, about the lunch line, and that people bought more broccoli when we had at the beginning. Was it also on the long term or only on the short term?
No, it changed their attitudes towards healthy behaviour because their behaviour changed. So yes, it was long term, not short term.
Okay, thank you.
Over there. What's the price of the book? What's the price of the book?
Whatever it is on Amazon, your level Amazon.
Yes, hello, thanks. Very interesting lecture. I was wondering about your source for what you mentioned about the different people responding to different things. So authority, majority rule, these kind of things, but stable over product categories.
It's something called persuasive profiling. Some work that's been done on looking at which heuristics people respond to. Some companies are actually putting this into practice now with customer databases and prospects. They're able to find out which I respond to, and then they gear their marketing materials and promotions accordingly. And sorry, what was the second part of your question?
No, so the question is really, where can I find more about it?
I can.
Your book. Yes.
If you give me your email, I can send you some details on persuasive profiling.
Okay, last question?
You showed the example of Milka with those different sizes of cookies. Did you also, and that was some changing behavior then towards what consumers intended to buy. Did you also test it with a neuroscience method?
No, this was a scientific. It wasn't our study. It was a published paper that compared self-report with then what people actually did. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, Phil. Thanks.
Thanks.